everyone. I'm Jacqueline Coley, and it's my honor to moderate this conversation at half hour with some of the filmmakers of the Nickel Boys. So please allow me to introduce the Oscar-nominated writers of the Nickel Boys, Joslyn Barnes and RaMell Ross. Hello and welcome.
Hello.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So for folks watching this one, a lot of them haven't maybe seen your incredibly and brilliant film, The Nickel Boys, RaMell. So I'd appreciate if you could just give us a quick overview of the film and what folks will have in store when they go and see it.
Yeah, it's a pretty visually dense film, but it centers around the relationship and the circumstances that bring two young men together, and the relationship over many decades and how that sort of plays out.
Excellent. And it is an incredible film. Let's go ahead and take a look at the trailer.
Long time, long time, long time.
Woo! That's it, El. You're doing great.
What happened to that one kid I used to hang with all the time?
You don't remember?
Remember what?
You really don't remember.
I don't know what more you want me to remember.
What are you gonna do? It's now or never.
Hello.
Wow. I mean, the trailer is even moving, incredible. Joslyn, I'd like to start with you as co-writer on this one. You, of course, worked with RaMell on his Oscar-nominated documentary feature, Hale County, this evening. Talk about those first conversations you had with him about adapting this and joining it, not only just as a producer, but also as a writer this time.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think working with RaMell on his feature doc, I really came to understand the way that, his the kind of patience he'd acquired in making images and the way that he allowed the camera to act as a kind of extension of consciousness. So when Plan B offered us the opportunity to direct and produce the film, and RaMell was asked to write it, and his initial proposal to shoot the entire film, what he called the sentient perspective, which we refer to as POV on the page, but which actually went further and deeper than that. I think I really understood that because in the doc, he had set about reorganizing and juxtaposing symbols of Blackness and Black life and trying to create a new relationship between the viewer and the lives on screen. And I think that understanding of the cinematic grammar that he wanted to work with led him to propose to me to co-write with him, which was not something I had originally anticipated doing. But the other producers agreed to that, and also to some of the other things that we had proposed, like no on-screen violence, things like this. And so we ended up writing it together.
Yeah, and I definitely want to dive into some of these early choices that you made, RaMell, because as Joslyn said, it very much speaks to the grammar and the language and almost the commitment that the audience has to make to be a part of this journey with you. But I want to talk about one particular thing that you decided that I found to be very powerful watching it was the absence of violence scene. And how that choice made early on it's a really interesting commitment given the subject matter, but one I think folks that don't know this movie yet should know going into it. So talk about that choice and then some of your other early ones that you made.
Well, it's such I think a joy to work with producers and co-writer Joslyn who think about the consequences of the media that we produce and we consume and that we imagine, and the ecosystem of all of those. It's interesting to think about, one, the relationship to a person who's experiencing violence to them, if you're going to take seriously having the camera as an extension of consciousness, making the camera an organ of your body and seen from a person's eyes. You wonder where their eyes are when the violence is happening to them. But then you also think about, the relationship between need for photojournalists to explore the violence that's happening in communities and share that with the world, and then the consequences of only having, or it seeming like, violence is the only images you're seeing of a certain population of people. And then in films and in dramas, like, who that violence is for. Like, why are we seeing 3 minutes of a certain type of action happening? Is that for entertainment? Are we supposed to at some point like learn something from what we're seeing, or what is the horror doing for us? And I think with where we are in the conversation as it relates to the relationship between seeing violence, its perpetration, its consideration, we decided to figure out other ways to explore the psychological violence or the consequences of the violence. And in that, you realize there's way more ways to do it and not show it than there is to just show it.
Yeah, so powerful. Another thing that was part of this is based on Colson Whitehead's Pulitzer Prize-winning work, obviously.
Mhm.
And, The Nickel Boys is a piece of fiction that is based on real life events. And the DNA of that is within the novel, but when you're adapting it for the visual form, that becomes even more a part of it. I'm curious how you approach that as a director, knowing what you were borrowing from. There's almost two texts. There's two things that you could borrow from, and how you decided which things from the actual real life events of Florida and how much from the novel found their way into the actual film.
Yeah, I think one thing that Jocelyn and I leaned on was trying to use the language of cinema and not the language of literature. I think it's one thing to take an adaptation illustratively, in which if you go from text to image, to some degree, the images are a servant to the language. But if you start with an image and then you transpose to language, then the language is a servant to the image. And it almost sounds like semantics, but when you think about the visual field and how complex it is, it's a fascinating process and experiment in the writing process to imagine scenes and to imagine moments in the lives of folks that have the sort of full interpretive depth as maybe what real life has, and then to try to place those in the architecture of Colson's novel. I think we lean towards choosing things from the book that we could produce an experience of, and not just have them be metaphors.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your choice as a director to resist transitional narrative, like that as a structural strategy, like RaMell talks a lot about suspending what he calls conclusive imagining. And the book is the book very much deals with cause and effect. And I think that there's a way in which we tried, because it's a visual medium, we tried to engage the viewer's own imaginative capacity. And so the way that we set about structuring the script, that kind of specificity of images, the narrative story, which you use scenes to develop the characters and their evolution across the film. And then there are adjacent images which deepen a kind of interiority and that open a larger imaginative world. And then there's archival images, both literal archival images from the Dozier School for Boys, which is what the story is based on, is a true school that was in Florida that was open for 111 years, closed in 2011 only. And where, the discovery of bodies is an ongoing process of exhumation. And there's been people who have come forward to give oral history testimony and witnessing. And inside of the film, we included both archival images that expand the world that we're situated in, but also which show you, you know, as the main character, as adult Elwood is going through the exhumation himself, learning online what has actually happened and seeing these images. These are images that we found in the process of doing the archival research as well. And those are also incorporated into the fabric of the film. And so this kind of, you know, as you say, there's a kind of DNA in a way, like we think about the strands of these kind of images as really three strands of DNA inside of this film instead of two. But which really that mix of things ideally opens an experience for you, the viewer. And you're also moving forward and backward in time, which makes the present the the area that is that experience of the present that you're in while watching a film. It makes it a little bit less determined. It kind of opens up different ways that you can interpret what's happening in the film, and you are invited to actively help put it together as you watch. And that's a pretty unusual experience when watching a film. And that was very much by design.
I love that.
Mm.
It was actually something that I found out later when I spoke to people, how there is such judiciousness between what is said and not said within the screenplay and within, you know, like just the guy that's running the entire facility, him being honored. There's like just a newspaper clipping of him being honored, which says so much. It's like, oh, this man's reputation was stellar in his community, despite the events of the film. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that part about it, RaMell, because when you're looking to find actors to be on this journey with you for this, there's a lot they have to take within your stage direction that is going to fill out their roles, because it's a huge commitment. Not as much as spelled out in what they're doing on screen. So it feels almost, obviously film is collaborative, but it feels like for each of these characters, what they don't say is indicative of their characters than it is what they do say. So how did you know which actors would be able to pull that off?
Well, I think a lot has to do with the team, the producing team that we were able to assemble, you know, from, you know, Alana Mayo to David Levine to Joss and Dee Dee and Jeremy. They have like such a breadth of experience working with actors and also in watching films. And I think, you know, having those conversations amongst everyone allowed us to, I mean, in most times, almost unanimously select folks. Like Aunjanue was everyone's number one, you know? There's something about her performance of the past and the idea of being in this grandmother role where we felt she had the emotional restraint to be the entire anchor of the film. You know, for someone like Hamish, if I remember correctly, that was like a Dee Gardner suggestion, you know, and, you know, it's not the first person you think of, you know, but then you go to his background and he's a theater guy and you see him, you know, he does a lot of sort of improv and he's kind of funny. And you're like, wait a second, this actually is the sort of astronaut, scientist, math teacher version of an oppressor that Joss and I had written as the character of Spencer. And, you know, the boys came up. Well, it's interesting because in hindsight, everyone fits their roles perfectly. And on paper they did, and in the casting tapes they were right, but you never know how it's going to be on the day. And everyone seemed to me to elevate all of the technical things that we had planned and all of the stage design of Nora Mendez to make it feel like it's something that's lived. For example, to not talk too much at length, but the bar scene, right, with Craig Tate. Who can take responsibility for that? You know, I definitely can't. I know that Joss and I, you know, arduously rolled over the language, but the language after it being relatively not bad is in the hands of its embodiment and the way in which the character executes and expresses it, you know? And what he did there is like even more than I imagined, and I think more than what others imagined, because everyone was watching that. And I promise you, in that moment, being like, this feels realer than anything I've ever experienced. It's like you were over this, we were all voyeurs on a true engagement between Craig Tate and David in that moment.
Yeah, and it's so funny that you mentioned that, because I would feel that you had to excel in top marks for all of the casting that you had to do.
Mm.
But David, the character that he plays, and we'll just leave it at that for folks that haven't seen it, how do you sell that? Because, not to tell anyone this, we don't see his face. This is
Mm.
a voice performance and a
Mhm.
perspective. Like, his hands have more screen time than any part of his face.
This is a body performance, you know, and that's why we wanted him, because of his theater background. And you know, he raps, he acts, he's pretty you know, Renaissance in these ways. And you realize, once you decide to use this camera technique, that the way in which his body opens to a character, like how much he leans forward with his head, how straight his back is, all of these become new sites of meaning that don't traditionally have as much impact as they would on a scene if the camera was in a more traditional place. And so having actors that, you know, the Zoom conversation was hilarious. I'm like, hey, David, how's it going? You know, we'd love for you to be in this film, but you won't see your face, you know? And he was like, cool, I'm in. You know, like,
Wow,
he
yay.
wanted that challenge. It's not, he doesn't famously say this, but I like saying the word famously. He famously said, he did say this, but it wasn't famous that he said it. He famously said, I didn't think the POV thing would work. So I was definitely in, you know, like it was such a challenge, such an ambitious thing that, like, I would love to contribute to this project, you know?
Joslyn, I want to bring it over to you, because one thing that I think is very powerful, and it kind of is alluding to what RaMell said, is the stage direction in between these dialogue scenes are, I'm sure, very powerful, because they have to do a lot. They have to. I'm curious if you could maybe give us a preview inside the screenplay and tell us one of those things that you remember writing with RaMell that brought in that DNA language that you talked about, that really sort of illustrates the type of notes that you had to put within the screenplay that would eventually fill out to what we got to see on screen.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think that you know, it's really in all of the scenes, I would say, because RaMell proposed that we shoot oneers, which means there was no coverage in the film. Everything is shot from a single point perspective. It meant that when constructing images and scenes and entire sequences, that we had to put an emphasis on duration, which meant that there was an elaboration of things that were important to see inside of the scene. On the other hand, we wanted to keep it really open in terms of what the actors, so that RaMell had room to work with the actors, so that the actors could also bring their own best to the performances that they were going to give. So there was trying to find that balance. And then also there was the choice of how to frame each shot. And I think that we had a script. We had one version that was incredibly detailed. I mean, where every single camera move was like laid out, and the other producers were like, "This is great, and I'm sure it will be helpful when we go to shoot the film." But in fact, no one can actually read this, and it won't work for the financiers of the film or for the cast. And it was great because we kind of, I mean, in a way, we kind of knew that, but we were also trying to really get to how RaMell was going to actually shoot these things. And I'd let RaMell speak to how he ultimately made this work with all the time he spent with Joe Mofrey, his cinematographer. But in scenes like the scene where, you know, they're driving to Nickel, where the police officer's driving three boys to Nickel, and that inside of that scene is also a scene, an archival scene from another film, where prisoners are being driven in the back of a van. That intercutting, and that was also inside of the script. The boxing match is written very much with an emphasis on what's happening between our two main characters, how they're interacting, and what it is they're actually seeing, and what the audience is seeing, as opposed to the traditional boxing match where you're seeing a slugfest. You know, this is a really different rendering of that. So you can see that very clearly. And I would say that's the same for most of the film. But we really did also want to leave room for interpretation. And I would say, you know, if you were writing a script just and you weren't, the director wasn't one of the writers, then it would be less detailed, of course, to allow the director to have more room. But because RaMell is one of the is the director, we could be much more specific in the script.
It's interesting because, you know, we wanted the film to feel like truly visual, and film is a visual medium, and so it almost sounds redundant, or like, of course that's true, but we came to the I think the approach where we wanted to be as minimalistic with language as possible.
Yeah.
You know, if we could have them say nothing in the scene and we could write it visually, then that's what we would do. And so you find that we're not trying to have someone follow the language of people speaking. We're trying to have people speak as closer to how they speak in real life, which is an impossibility. And we know that cinema does a weird twisty thing with what you expect language to be. But I think the best example of that is when Hattie comes to visit Turner. Not to give it away, but there's a time, like the conversation that she has with Turner is very spare and almost to herself. You know, you would expect for her to have a kind of one-on-one dialogue with him and be talking about the school and what's going on. But if we're going to take the scene and like what a person would feel in a moment, it's more about the confusion of her being more than the confusion of her language. And so the language in it is very scattered and very kind of half sentences, and we played with that a bunch.
Yeah, I think this movie is the quintessential example of show, not tell. So rather than me keep talking, let's go ahead and take a peek at another clip from the film.
White woman, she's my daddy on his way home from his second job. My big, cheerful daddy. I saw you. I waved at you from across the street on my way home from school. White woman say, he didn't get out of my way. Two days later, still waiting on a judge, hanged in his cell. God was the judge that day. Lord, I didn't take no more than my portion. White man teach you not to take no more crumbs than he give you. Nope. I paid. My daddy paid. My auntie paid. Protecting others from paying. Percy paid when he got home. The army don't protect you here, honey. Why? Why? Because your portion is pain. But not my Elwood. Not my Elwood.
Nana, I'll be back soon.
Yeah? You see what Mr. Hill brought you? Isn't that nice? Come on, sit down with Nana. Have some cake.
That POV perspective that you speak so much to, and that is a part of the visual language. I'd love if you could talk about what that meant for your actors in
Mm,
regards to what they were having to do, because that also meant, in addition to these sometimes unspoken emotional things that they're trying to portray within their performance while they're saying something very ordinary, there's a very precise way that you have to place the camera to get these shots the way that you want.
mm,
And that's a huge commitment from your actors. RaMell, I'd
mm.
love for you to talk about how you made that happen. And I heard you say this, like you kind of had to lie a little bit to them
I
to
would
get them.
never, I am not a person who stretches the truth, uses hyperbole, or exaggerates.
You're a director.
Yeah. Well, I think what we did was and honestly, it was a natural, it wasn't like I want everyone to feel comfortable genuinely. I want people to have a good time. I also want to challenge them, and I want everyone to do their best. Sometimes maybe those are competing in the methodology, but we did not overemphasize the technique of the film. In the script, of course, it says point of view, and this will be point of view, this would be point of view, but to the degree that the actors understood how we would shoot it was determined by the questions they asked me about how they were going to shoot it, and no one asked me about how we were going to shoot it. So I'm not going to just like I'm just not going to go into the concepts of how it's shot. um
Yeah.
they very much know that they have a monumental task at hand, which is to feel real on camera. And so I think unconsciously, I felt that sticking with that was the extent to which, we started, I guess, if that's a proper way to finish the sentence. They did need to stare exactly at a point on the lens where it looked like they were looking into it. And like if they looked anywhere else, it just didn't work, which
Um,
we didn't realize until, of course, we had the camera that we were using with the actors. Oh, wow, that feels wrong. This one feels good. But it's quite interesting how these things play out, because in doing these conversations, specifically with Aunjanue, and because she has kind of the most emotional relationship with the camera. She is exuding, as she's looking at Elwood or looking at Turner. And she said something really interesting, which was that for her, she thought that there was going to be like POV moments in the film, and she kind of skipped over it when she was reading the script. And when we started and the entire scene was her looking at this camera, she said she has a very fraught relationship with cameras, as a lot of people do, or people of color, realizing the history of cinema and photography and production of Blackness, et cetera, et cetera. So she said not having a scene partner in the traditional sense, she felt so lonely, like she felt kind of isolated out there. But then she realized that Hattie is lonely and Hattie is by herself. And the uncomfortable relationship she had with being seen in this way and being sort of isolated, she brought that into the way that she composited the character inside herself, which gave her another well to draw from, which was, something that I think only the best actors can do, which is take something that's super unexpected, something that is built into it, like the atmosphere, and use it to your benefit.
hmm. Yeah, and let's be honest, she's quite good. Quite
She's
good.
incredible. She's incredible.
Yeah.
Before we get out of here, I want to give you both this real big question, if you could. If there's one thing that you would want folks to know about the Nickel Boys that stands out for why they should want to check it out, what would that be? And Jocelyn, I'll start with you.
I would say that the film is conceived with and built on love, and that people should, because I know that there's an abundance of concern that people have about being traumatized. It's a hard story about a hard place in the world when those two boys end up in Nickel Academy and the way it shaped their lives. That is a difficult story, but I want people to know that it's made with love and that they will feel that when they watch the film, and that they're being invited into a, a, into a film that really is crafted with the desire to extend an invitation to participate. and that comes from respect from all the people who made it.
Yeah, I don't like following Joss, because
Sorry.
I tend to be thinking about what she said as opposed to considering what I would, and then I'm in the clouds. But maybe I'll add, the film is about life and it's not about death. And I think what Joss and I felt was the most unprecedented opportunity was to bring the real boys, the real story from the Dozier School into the sort of fantasy and fiction space, and do it through POV, which is it only connects you to them. It connects you to them as much as you're willing to let go,
Thank you both for the lovely panel today, and thank you so much for joining us. I also want to thank the folks at Amazon MGM Studios and remind all of you that you can check out screenings from the Nickel Boys today. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you.